What we need to do now is take a look at the results of the Exam 1 Review Federalists versus Anti-Federalists quiz, this being the extended version of that, so that we can be prepared for the upcoming exam. And remember, you won't see these exact same quotes again on the exam, but you will see similar concepts, and so it's worth making sure you understand the correct answers to these and the reasoning behind those answers. So let's begin. The states are and should remain the core of our republic. It is there that the people can be properly represented. When states have to bend to the central government's will, the people will pay with their liberty. Who would have made this statement? Well, from this particular class, 100% of participants correctly answered that it is the Anti-Federalists. And there are a couple of ways that we can know this. One, we see the conversation focusing on states being the proper core of our republic. Anti-Federalists were very much about state power and state independence, and so seeing something that puts the states still at the center of the country's government or the republic, that's a clue that we're talking about Anti-Federalists. The other clue here is a concern about a powerful central government, right? Being something that might take away the people's liberty. Right? That was another Anti-Federalist argument. So either one of those by itself is enough to give us enough of a nudge to know that this is an Anti-Federalist argument. Right? And that's reflected in the fact that 100% of students got that correct. Right. Moving on to the next quote. A written list of rights sounds like a great idea until you think about it a little harder. Can we all agree on 10 things or even 100? Would those make up the whole list? What about something you think of later? Is it not protected? Putting things on paper makes it seem like there are only so many rights worth protecting. Who would have made this statement? Okay, for this one, there are, again, a couple of ways to know the correct answer. One, Federalists were opposed to a written Bill of Rights. So if you see someone criticizing making a list of rights, it's a Federalist. Whereas Anti-Federalists supported a Bill of Rights, they wanted a list, and so anybody criticizing a list of rights is probably not an Anti-Federalist. Our third quote, a government simply cannot operate, provide critical services, and support a military without money. A reasonable amount of taxes is needed to maintain a functional federal government. The alternative is a do-nothing government and a non-existent national defense. Growth and improvement cost money but are worth the investment. This question divided the class. As you can see, only half of students that participated answered this question correctly. So let's think about why this is the correct answer. One, remember, if your depth of knowledge is stronger on this one, a lack of tax revenue was a huge problem before we had the United States Constitution, when we were still operating under the Articles of Confederation. It was a huge problem. We couldn't pay for the military. We couldn't pay money that we owed to other countries and lenders that, or at least were outside of America. We were a basket case. And so one of the Federalists' big arguments for a stronger central government is that it would be able to collect taxes to do the things the country needed to do. So on the one hand, that information helps you correctly identify this as Federalist. There's also some information in here that helps us rule out the Anti-Federalists, which always makes us more sure of our answer, right? If we know why one is right and why we're very sure that the other option is wrong. And here, right, what might be our clue is that whoever's making this argument is concerned about a do-nothing government. Anti-Federalists really aren't that concerned with a do-nothing government. Right? They like a central government that is not very active or very powerful. So if you see somebody who's worried about a do-nothing government or a government without much power, that's probably a Federalist. Anti-Federalists are quite happy with a weak national government. So again, we've got two ways of getting at that. The need for taxation was something the Federalists wanted, so you've got a reason to think that Federalist is the right answer. A do-nothing government is not something that would upset an anti-Federalist, so it seems unlikely that they would be complaining about this. So again, you've got something that steers you towards Federalists as the right answer, and information that helps convince you that anti-Federalists has to be the wrong answer. This next question deals with representation, and as you can tell, this was also a tricky one for students, with only half of participants getting the correct answer. I see no reason to restrict the representation of small states in the House. America deserves a government with balanced state power, giving each an equal seat at the table. Okay, so one of our real clues here is balanced state power. This was something that existed under the Articles, and it was something that the Anti-Federalists were in favor of. Now, if that doesn't make you feel confident that you could see a similar quotation to this and identify it as anti-federalist, let's take it a step further. This argument, whoever's making it, is being critical of the Constitution's design, making the House of Representatives a proportional representation body. Remember, the Virginia plan meant that the Senate would have equal representation, 2 senators per state, whereas representation in the House would be based on a state's population. So if we see someone criticizing the design for the House of Representatives in the Constitution, most likely that is not going to be a Federalist. Federalists support the Constitution. They're not going to be pointing out its weaknesses. Right? Whereas an anti-Federalist would both be concerned about state power, as we see in this highlighted portion here, and also would be much more likely to criticize some aspect of the Constitution's design. So we've got, again, 2 ways to help us zero in on the right answer. Moving on to another quote that was problematic for the class. After our breakup and war with King George III a few years back, why would we want another king at the head of our new government? Supporters say that the president will be elected. I don't think that means he won't go looking for a crown. Who would have made this statement? This one, I really was kind of surprised that students struggled with it because there's very much a clear fear in this quote about a strong government and a strong leader at the head of that government. And that was a big concern of the Anti-Federalists. So somebody who's afraid of a strong government is a Federalist, and at the same time, a Federalist would be happy about this. So we have somebody who's upset about a strong government. That leans us towards Federalists, or Anti-Federalists, I should say. At the same time, we know that Federalists really weren't worried about this. In fact, the Federalists designed a constitution that had an elected president. So we have every reason to expect that Federalists would not be making this statement. And on the other hand, good reasons to think that this would be an anti-Federalist argument. This next question, this next quote divided the class straight down the middle. The Senate creates a completely unequal setting for legislation. As it stands, the tiny state of Delaware has as much representation in the Senate as a large and populous state like Virginia. How is this fair? How is this democratic? Who would have made this statement? Well, as you can see, the correct answer is anti-Federalists. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, well, hey, guys, scroll up a little bit. Because there was just this quote up here that was also anti-Federalist, and it's complaining about the fact that the House doesn't have equal representation. And with this part right here. And they're saying, look, every state should have an equal seat at the table. And then we scroll down here, right? They're saying that this equal representation is actually completely unequal because it gives tiny states like Delaware as much representation as much larger Virginia. So you're thinking, well, how in the world am I supposed to get both of those questions right? Well, here's the trick. When you see somebody criticizing some part of the Constitution's design, it's probably not a Federalist. Because again, Federalists don't want to point out reasons for people not to ratify the new Constitution. They want to make arguments in favor of it. Right? So if you see something that's critical, that should be a first little nudge that it's probably not a Federalist argument. To help you understand why it is, in fact, clearly an anti-Federalist argument, all you have to think of is this is an argument against the Constitution. Right? The anti-Federalists want to win. Right? They're not concerned that 200 plus years later, we will look at them as hypocrites for complaining about the House and complaining about the Senate for totally incompatible reasons. Right? We can say they were hypocrites. Fine. They wanted to win. They wanted to defeat the Constitution. So they criticized it. Didn't matter that it wasn't consistent. You make the small states angry by talking about the House. You make the large states angry by talking about representation in the Senate. It's an argument against the Constitution, and that means it is an anti-Federalist argument. Okay, we're back to the issue of listing rights. The supporters of the Constitution do not believe a listing of the rights of the people is necessary. They are wrong. We need a Bill of Rights to make sure the government doesn't take away our liberties. Who would have made this statement? Well, as you can see, it's an anti-Federalist statement. And we have a couple of things that tell us this. One, they mention supporters of the Constitution, and in the very next sentence say they are wrong. If we know nothing else, we know that Federalists are supporters of the Constitution, and someone calling them wrong must be from the other side, right? Hence must be an anti-Federalist. It's nice to know a bit more of the background for this so that we don't just have to play these kind of logical games to get at the right answer. We also know that the anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights. So if we see someone calling for a Bill of Rights, saying, we need a Bill of Rights, that's an anti-Federalist. Federalists were opposed to a Bill of Rights. So if we're on a stronger foundation of knowledge, this is what gives it away. If we're a little shaky, if we want some reassurance, we can use this trick. Right? Supporters of the Constitution are wrong. Well, that's an anti-Federalist statement because they are the opponents of the Constitution. We next look at the issue of slavery. And this one is tricky, and it's reflected in the fact that almost 2/3 of respondents missed this question. Critics from both sides have complained about how slavery is treated in this proposed Constitution. Some wanted more protections for the institution of slavery, while others wanted it abolished entirely. The only way to move forward is to compromise. We must leave this debate to the future. And this is tough. Right? This is not anything necessarily clearly Federalist or anti-Federalist in the sense that it's focused on slavery. You would have found amongst Federalists opponents of slavery and anti-Federalists. You would have found many of them to have been opposed to slavery. The issue here is not so much slavery itself, but this last bit. They're saying, however you feel about slavery, we need to move forward with a compromise. Well, why do we need to move forward with a compromise? Well, because this is a Federalist's argument, and the Federalists say we need to move forward because moving forward means getting the new Constitution. So if you see any talk in a quote about needing to set aside differences and compromise so that we can have a Constitution, a new Constitution, you're most likely looking at the argument of a Federalist. Anti-Federalists are perfectly happy to see this debate drag out as long as possible, and hey, maybe we never get a new Constitution. So however they might feel about slavery, they might be perfectly happy to let slavery derail the ratification process. So if you think about it in that sense, you can understand this as a Federalist argument. They are the only ones in a hurry to ratify the Constitution. Next up, and we're starting to return to a more favorable balance here with nearly 2/3 of respondents getting the answer correct. Opponents of the Constitution are trying to scare you away with unfounded tales about the judicial branch. Here's the truth. This is the smallest and least powerful branch in the government. It cannot tax you, command the military, or take away your rights. It is created to protect your liberty. Remember that. So who would have made this statement? Well, if you are pretty well versed in this information, you know that the new Constitution created a judicial branch that had not existed before, and that there were people afraid of it, and Federalists were trying to convince them that they didn't need to be afraid. So that makes it a Federalist argument. That's kind of the positive reason that it's a Federalist argument. On the other hand, if you're not as confident, there's a perfect clue in the first third of the quote. Opponents of the Constitution are trying to scare you. But here's the truth. Okay, well, so they're saying that the opponents of the Constitution are trying to scare you, but they're wrong. Right? They don't have the truth. Well, if Anti-Federalists are the opponents of the Constitution and someone is saying that they are just trying to scare you and they're not doing so with the truth, that's an argument against the Anti-Federalists. Who's going to be making an argument against the Anti-Federalists? Federalists. And it's a nice process of elimination. And so again, two ways to know this one. And with a lot of these, with most of these, there are at least two ways of knowing. This one returns us really to solidly correct answers from participants. The common people do not have the refinement to participate directly in the government. A chosen body of citizens will refine the desires of the masses and apply their wisdom to ruling the nation. Who would have made this statement? This one I actually expected to be much more challenging for students because there's not necessarily anything here that's for or against the Constitution. What we have is an elitist argument that we can't just trust the citizens with running the country. It is an elitist argument, and it is a Federalist argument. Federalists wanted to move more of the power to the central government and do more to disconnect it from the direct influence of the citizens because they thought that most of the people did not have the refinement to run a government. So this kind of snobby argument fits in with the Federalists' ideas. You guys did really well with that. I was pleasantly surprised to see that many correct answers because that was a tough question. All right, now we're moving away from the quotes to some other information we need to know. Which reason was not one used to argue for the ratification of the new Constitution? Okay, so we want to know things that were not used as reasons to get a new Constitution. So the correct answer here was a president would become too powerful. Right? Fear of a powerful president is certainly not an argument that was used in favor of ratification. Just the opposite was true. They said, look, the president's going to be elected. He's not going to be able to stick around forever. It's going to be okay. So they certainly were not arguing in favor of the Constitution by saying, hey, this president guy, he's going to be too powerful. Right? Just wait and see. No, that's not the argument you would make if you want people to support the new Constitution. And on the other hand, supporters of the Constitution did argue that it would solve existing problems, like the government's inability to collect taxes. We also know that supporters could argue that the Connecticut or Great Compromise addressed the needs of large and small states. Large states got proportional representation in the House of Representatives based on state population. Small states got equal representation to senators per state in the Senate. So both had something to be happy about. And finally, Congress needed the power to tax. That was clearly one of the arguments made in favor of ratification. We've got to collect money because we've got to pay our bills. Okay, This is just one of those things. I'm not big on memorizing specific numbers unless it's absolutely necessary. In this case, it is important for us to understand that ratification required 9 out of the 13 states in order to pass. I know some of you want to go with 13 because you thought maybe it needed to be unanimous with all 13 of the states agreeing. It did not. And there's some argument about that, but about whether that was right. The reality is the requirement set down in the Constitution was that you needed 9 out of the 13. Okay, with these statements, this was pretty consistent across all 3 of the classes that took this quiz. Many people disagreed on ratification of the Constitution in 1787. 100% of you picked that as a correct answer, and it is true. That's the whole reason we have this Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate that we spend so much time talking about. The second one, and always a slightly smaller number of people picked this as another right answer, but it is. Women had opinions on the Constitution even if they couldn't vote. As it turns out, if we pulled the word women out of that sentence and plugged in poor white males without who didn't own land, the sentence would be just as true. They had opinions even if they couldn't vote. Slaves had opinions even if they couldn't vote. Native Americans had opinions even if they couldn't vote. Everybody's got opinions, even if they don't get to vote about them. Many of you are not 18 and not old enough to vote, and yet you have opinions. So for the one person who didn't pick that also as the correct answer, just think about it that way. Right? Everybody's got opinions all the time. Even if you lived in a country where you didn't have free speech, you'd have opinions. You just might keep them to yourself. Right. This statement is not true because really the stronger central government was a big danger and harm to Native Americans. It is what allowed Americans to uproot groups from the southern United States and move them out to Oklahoma, and most infamously in the Trail of Tears. This next one, about half of you picked this. We need to make sure that we correct our view of this statement. The states had the most power under the U.S. Constitution. No, the states had the most power under the Articles of Confederation. They had much less power under the U.S. Constitution because the U.S. Constitution created a much more powerful central government than what had existed under the Articles. Right, so be very careful with that statement. And finally, America has always had a strong central government. Most of you steered clear of this one, and that's good. America has not always had a strong central government. That was the whole point in the Federalists thinking we needed to create a new constitution so that we could, in fact, have a strong central government. Okay, now this one is going to be a bit trickier for us to review. Let's zoom out just a little bit so we can see all of this at once. All right. What you needed to do in this part of the task was match a Federalist or Anti-Federalist big idea on the right to an example from the left. Right, now it shows up a little funky here when we're looking at the answers. So these were our examples, and these are our big ideas. So for the first one, didn't we fight a revolution to get rid of a strong leader with too much power? Well, this connects to the executive. And what we're talking about here is the Federalist fear of a strong executive with a strong leader. There is no middleman, no appointments, just democracy in its finest form. Half of you got that right, and that's understandable. This is tough. If we think about the federal government today, senators are directly elected, the House is directly elected. The only part of it that still isn't is the presidency. But in this time period, the president, then as now, is picked by an electoral college, not directly by the people. The Senate, on the other hand, is different from what we have now. The Senate in this time period is appointed by state legislators. So that would be the Missouri General Assembly and Senate picking who would be the senators from our state rather than us going out and voting for them. Right, so in this time period, there's only one part of the national government we can say has no middleman, no appointments, just democracy, the people picking their leaders. And that's the House of Representatives, because then, just as today, members of the House are directly elected by the citizens within their districts. Okay, this one, a pretty solid showing, 63% of you got it correct. This one is about money. It's more about who's taking the money, how it's being used, and how the people gain from it. Right? If something's talking about money, right, well, here we really only have two options. It could be tariffs, which are taxes on imports, so there's money, or, and this is the correct answer, it could be general taxation. Right, so if we have to think of one thing that's most clearly about the money, it's going to be taxation. This one can also throw people, and I understand that. I see no guarantee of the right to trial by jury in civil trials, which is a basic piece of civil government, by the way. So there's a concern about rights to a trial by jury, which might have steered some of you towards Bill of Rights, but actually it didn't. Most of you got this correct. It is about the judiciary branch. Right? Judiciary is judicial. It's where the judges and the juries are. It's the courts. So that's where we would be concerned about trials. All right, so nicely done on that one. Okay, next up. This is as far from representative as you can get. They aren't elected. They serve long terms. They are not of the people. So as you see, the correct answer is the Senate. And remember, at this time, the Senate is not elected. It's appointed by state legislatures. They served what were thought of as very long terms of 6 years. And they were thought of as not being your common people. So that was a criticism by the Federalists. Okay, individual liberties are protected all over the place. Okay, well, other words for liberty include freedom and rights. So, of our choices, kind of our obvious lock here is Bill of Rights. It's what protects liberties. This one can also be a bit difficult. It's simply used as a bargaining token, nothing more. The promises of that preamble are not for my people. So we think about this, they're talking about people, right? My people, as opposed to somebody else's people. And the promises of the preamble, which remember, the preamble is the introduction to the Constitution, saying the promises of that preamble are not for my people. Well, what group of people were excluded from government in the Constitution? Well, there's only one group like that in this list, and that's slaves. So that one links to slavery. And finally, the more powerful the federal government gets, the weaker the states get. It's pretty simple. This fear here about taking power from the states and giving it to the government is extended republic. And this concept can be tricky. It was in your reading materials, but the idea of extending the republic out from the states, right? Extending representative government all the way to the national level. And the concern here in this Anti-Federalist quote is that the federal government would get more powerful and the states would get weaker. And what we would eventually see is too much power in the hands of the national government and the states have become too weak, according to the Anti-Federalists. Okay, well, I hope that review gives you a better sense of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debate and the ideas associated with those debates. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I've provided this resource so that you can review this information on your own time, but it's not meant to be a substitute for actual interaction with me. All right, take care, be safe, and I will see you in class.